everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Meg Smith. I live here in Lowell, which is an awesome city to live in for a writer and people who like adventures and for many things. And so I'm delighted to live here, and I'm delighted that we have a great new bookstore here in Lowell, Mass. And I've been telling everybody to please come out, check it out, support the events, and support the books and the bookstore. So I'm going to read a little bit from both of the books I have here. The first one is called The Plague Confessor, and it's a collection of short stories, and the stories range greatly in the time that they were written. Some are from the early 90s, some are right up to the present. And one thing I like about being a writer is you can travel in time, to the past, to the future, to the here and now. I'd like to read from the title story of this book. And despite the name, this story was actually written about 3 years ago. And I was inspired by, I do things like watch documentaries about plagues. I come from a public health family. Both my parents were in nursing. I'm a journalist, so all this made a big impression on me. I'm also very interested in, I'm interested in a lot of world civilizations, but I'm definitely interested in medieval Europe. I was watching one of these documentaries one night, because I think watching a documentary about a deadly plague is a great way to help you go to sleep. I was really struck by one of the things that was mentioned in this particular documentary, and it had to do with, and I'm sure that part of it is because I am a Catholic, and part of it is I was just struck by what was said at that time, and it was basically a Catholic majority society at the time. Confessing one's sins before dying, if you were a Catholic, and this is still true, is a very big deal, and to not be able to do that in that place and time was really very difficult for a lot of people. And the Pope decided that because so many priests, who actually by rights would give confession, were themselves dying, he just finally said, look, we're in extraordinary times. You can confess to anybody, a friend, a family member, and it really doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman. So that was kind of the inspiration for this story. And I will just mention, of course, we're living through a very difficult public health crisis ourselves. This is not a story with a lot of visual violence or anything like that. But I do like to make mention ahead of time, just for folks, if there's something that you need to take care of yourself, that comes first. So from The Plague Confessor. And by the way, the narrator of the story is is middle-class legal clerk. So he's the one telling the story. I will begin with the events of the year of our Lord, 1348, which dawned with prayers for life where we have only known death. I, Arturo de Taro, am not a man of great standing, but I bring to bear my writing skill and my training as a solicitor's clerk. There are men more eloquent, sure, but they have taken their eloquence with them to the graves, stacked, layered like cheese in a lasagna, and I am not the first person to make that comparison. When the first people took sick, Bishop Sorino sent priests door to door, and some refused to go, defying the order. Even the priests who refused soon succumbed. Again and again, the faithful, wiping bloody spittle from their lips, asked the same question. Why were some allowed to live and others to die? I lost my wife and my daughter, yet I lived. It was as if the angel of death simply cast about blindfolded, striking down one and sparing another. Then word came from his Holy Father, Pope Clement. It was a notice posted on church doors and carried by heralds. If there is no priest, confess to one another. If necessary, confess to a woman. To ask for an explanation was futile. These heralds moved quickly, their heads covered in hoods that surely became shrouds for some of them. The absurdity spoke for itself. After all, this ruling came, as such ecclesiastical pronouncements had for some time, from the papal residence of satin, scarlet, and lavish banquets in Avignon in France. And in truth, many wondered if His Holiness brought this disaster upon his people by refusing to return to the rightful seat of the Church in Rome. Answers, such as there were any, lay with those laid to rest in choked cemeteries and even in riverbeds. Meanwhile, the Pope remained sequestered in his French sanctuary, with only great fires around him for company, as prescribed by his physician. But here, in Piazza della Rosa, my home since childhood, a quiet residential district in Florence, walls echoed with coughs and wails of mourning. I had a friend, Tommaso de Macho Spellini, who I saw gazing at the edict, wraps of linen pulled around his face and shaking his head. He was a good man, a man who lived by the letter of law. If anyone would linger outdoors to ponder the posting of the Pope's emergency ruling, it would be he. I saw Tommaso de Macho Spellini from my window. I did not go out, though my heart broke for an embrace of one who was so like a brother to me. He turned. I saw consternation in his eyes, once bright, now filmed like a polluted river. What woman would go door to door in times of good health or bad? Tommaso de Macho Spellini held up a hand to wave. I did, and we both made a vague sign of the cross to one another. Then his shoulders rose and fell, as if his body sighed. He turned back to the direction of his own home. I do not know if he made any final act of contrition to anyone, man, woman, or child, or perhaps the stray geese now padding about in the street indifferently. My persistence in my habits and training of keeping a fastidious diary with dates and recollections anchored me to any workable sense of time. Without my family, my wife's laughter, her singing when she thought none of us could hear her, my daughter saying, "Ah, Mama, I promise we won't listen," all other markers of the life cycle seemed to cease. I let our cat into the house. She was a fine hunter of rats, but the screech and scratch of their mortal dance now seemed dull met. Once I let her in, she ventured out only furtively. It was not long before I began singing to her, as my wife had once sung to some invisible, angelic audience. No more heralds came. At night, distantly, there sometimes came the crackle of fire, churlish laughter, and absurdly, the playing of a lute or tambourine and song. Not my wife's beatific song, but vulgar tavern verses. I knew what was happening. Those of us left to take stock of anything knew what it was. There were those who simply grew tired of staying inside. They went out in ragged, stumbling bands, having broken into the wine stores of deceased vintners. As they staggered, laughing, through the streets and down the alleys, their numbers grew. This raucous mob would simply drift into the houses of the deceased, take anything of value, gorge themselves on food stores, and give themselves over to whatever pleasures they might enjoy before death came for them too. But I adopted a posture of vigilance. Even without my family and only a cat for company, I was not about to surrender my goods or my life. Visitors became a thing of the past, and with such disorder about, the prospect of visitors was not a welcome one. So it was when one day I heard a knock at my door. I peered out the window first and then drew back, shaking my head. I caught myself looking down at the cat, lying in an arch in a rare spot of sunlight, as if she could explain. I wasn't inclined to answer the door for anyone in those days, but the knock was followed by a curiously soft voice, like a wisp of vapor in the morning air. I drew a scarf close to my face and took my stave in one hand, and I opened the door. Standing there was a slight girl, young but with the wizen look of a grandmother, with a thin gauze scarf about her head. It took me a moment, but then recognition came to me like a flash of sun between clouds. Her name was Caterina, and she was a prostitute. "Signor," she said, "forgive my intrusion. I'm looking for the home of a man named Bartolomeo Bernardo." I thought but did not ask aloud. Why would Bartolomeo Dinardo be seeking the company of a prostitute so indiscreetly? The social order was truly eroding, I marveled. That these transactions occurred was a fact of life. That they would happen so brazenly surely signaled a greater breakdown, just like the intoxicated burglars. But Katerina herself gave the answer. His wife is pleading for someone to hear his confession, Katerina said. I pointed across to his house. She thanked me and turned to go. Over the course of the next few weeks, I noticed something. The roads, the streets had gone mostly quiet, except for the wails, day and night, of those who had lost yet another family member. Men went out with carts, rags tied about their mouths, and those who had the strength carried out their dead. They were taken to the grounds where they were buried one atop the other. It was not long before this too ceased and bodies went into the river. And now another practice now allowed by distant papal edicts. I did not venture out much myself, except when necessary, such as to go to the market. I soon stopped doing that because there was no market. I ate vegetables from my own garden and took in a pheasant or duck when I could. Still, I kept watch, as I am sure many were doing. I kept watch as to who was outside. Houses where no one had survived or been burgled, even ransacked. And who was to say these hoodlums wouldn't soon prevail upon houses of those still living? I was ready all the time. But after that perfunctory arrival at my door, I now saw Katerina, from time to time, alone, making her rounds. Katerina, the streetwalker, going in and out of these houses, hearing the dying in their pleas for forgiveness and absolution. It was as if God had spared her for this purpose. Not long after Katerina started on her strange new vocation, there was another knock at my door. And this visitor, too, was a woman, the daughter of a well-to-do family for whom I had drafted some documents of property and asset transfer some year ago. She was Signora Veronica de Gentili Aldoviti, and she was the lone adult survivor in her family. Her husband had died. I remember attending his funeral when proper funerals could still be held. Then her father succumbed. Her mother had long since died in childbirth to Veronica. Veronica, it seemed, was now alone, but she had inherited all of her family's properties and assets. From the look on her face, I could see that was of little consolation. In time, to any of us working in the legal profession, it would become clear. There were women surviving alone who stood to inherit their husbands' and families' estates. Either the plague was bringing the world to an end, or a curious new world to a beginning. Signor, she said, forgive the intrusion. I've come to see if there's anyone here in need of medical assistance. Thanks be to God, I am well, I told her. He has seen fit to take my wife and daughter, and so they are beyond the need of any medicine. I am sorry, Signor, she said. I remember them well. I saw them often at Mass. I am sure they are with the angels. Then she paused. People are saying it is God's displeasure that the world is done. Has God sent you to look after the dead and the dying? I was genuinely curious and puzzled. The physician can no longer do it, she said, and his assistants are themselves ill, or they simply refuse. How can they refuse those who are ill? She sighed, and for the first time tears pooled in her eyes, and grief showed through her resolve. Signor, I must tell you, you must surely know. If you could see what I have already seen, mothers and daughters are fleeing their own children. Merciful God, I breathed. I am looking for those children, she said, who are left alone. For whatever reason, God has seen fit to spare me, so I'm doing what I can for them. I will send word to your home, and if I hear of those in need, I pledged. That is all I ask, and thank you, she said, turning to leave. As she walked away alone, her pace steady with purpose, I saw Katerina approach her. I watched the two women stop and talk to each other. They were a bit far for me to hear what they said. I looked out at the two covered, graceful figures disappearing over the hill. It seemed they had decided together That made sense, and clearly, it was safer. That night I lay sleepless and my conscience weighed me. For a woman to be walking without male protection, even in the best of times, was inviting trouble. What if they were to encounter those same toughs who had laid waste to so many empty houses? They were brave, braver than I. I looked at the cat, getting up and moving to follow her patch of sun, as if she could somehow assuage my growing sense of guilt. And that's from the short story, The Plague Confessor. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening. So, I'd also like to read from my book of poetry, but before I move on to that, I figured I'd just stop if anyone had, questions or anything. Cool.
Was there a lot of research that went into that, looking at the time, or?
I would love to tell you that I was sequestered in great ivy-covered libraries and digging through, the catacombs of Europe. Here's the reality, and I've had the good fortune to travel to Ireland and Germany and places like that. But really, I certainly am a lover of books, of course, and I've read a lot about the medieval Europe, what's sometimes known as the Middle Ages, and about this part of time in particular. And again, as I mentioned, I grew up in a family of public health, so public health concerns are sort of all around us all the time. I'm from the generation where you had to get vaccinated for smallpox and polio if you wanted to go to school. It was not an argument. And so this was a time when, as now, honestly, when there were diseases of a global scale that were still a threat. And nothing was taken for granted. And I think that probably made a big impression on me. And also, both of my parents grew up in kind of hard scrabble places. My mother in Ireland and my father in Charlestown, which was at that time very much an Irish neighborhood of Boston. And so they in their lifetimes had seen their share of things. My mother had a brother who died of an infection when he was 10 years old from having a tooth pulled. And her sister nearly lost a leg to tuberculosis. And my maternal grandfather, who worked in the famous distillery in Middleton in Ireland, he succumbed to tuberculosis as well. So I think that in a personal way made a stamp on me. And then we live in a time now where what's so amazing is that there are resources available such as documentaries. Honestly, I went searching on YouTube and I was like, oh look, here's some documentaries about what's sometimes called the Black Plague. So I was interested not only in ways that diseases can be spread, how they're spread, and I should give a nod here that I also come from the generation when AIDS was very much is still a threat worldwide, but was definitely something that took a lot of lives, as we know. And so I was interested in how people respond to diseases, to public health crises. I was interested in how what would happen to the various prejudices and social conventions and economic conventions of the time when you put a deadly disease of that magnitude into the midst. What happens to people and the choices that they make?
I suppose you have to see it firsthand.
Yeah, and as a journalist, I've certainly done a lot of public health writing. I wrote a series for the 20th anniversary of the AIDS crisis, and I wrote one for the 40th anniversary of the AIDS crisis. And sadly, many of the people from that first series I did are no longer here. Did not have the treatments available to them. And of course, as a journalist, I think, even though that story was written a while back, I think I did begin to feel somewhat of a kinship with this character, this middling Florentine clerk. And by the way, the story is set very deliberately in Florence, because Florence was a major hub of commerce and travel. And the thinking is that the pandemic in Europe probably started in Sicily, that's the thought, and then made its way up into the Italian peninsula through these beautiful, prosperous cities. and Florence was considered, one of the really badly hit places. So I think it's something of just the research is kind of through books, through travels when I can. Just having been a journalist, chronicling people's experience, yeah. So I guess it kind of all, came together that way.
So as a writer, I can be a little bit like superstitious, sort of like the speak of the devil and no day shall appear. You said you wrote this 3 years ago, and I'm listening to some of the details, like people breaking quarantine in the middle of the night, just drinking and acting like,
Yeah, they would actually do this. They would go out and do whatever they wanted.
If you hear a knock on the door, you grab a face covering before you answer it. I mean, it's stuff that you're almost predicting what would happen in March of 2020. So, like, did that thought ever cross your mind when you actually were publishing this?
To be honest with you, I think I've had and maybe always had a sense, just because pandemics are things that have happened in human history and have happened in my lifetime. I don't think I had any sense of like foreboding or foreshadowing. I quite honestly, I was really just kind of thinking about, I think I'd like to set a story in the during the so-called Black Plague. And there's some debate as to what that infection actually was. So it was generally thought to be a bacterial one, which is really, when you think about it, now we were probably treated with, antibiotics, most likely. Such a sad thing to comprehend. But honestly, I think at that time I just wanted to tell a good story with the influences that I had, and taking time to be true to that time period. With historical fiction, I have sort of an ambivalent relationship to it, especially as a woman. I want to read a story about how women and men, anyone, how they would probably really act or behave or respond in their time. In other words, I don't need a female character to display 21st century values or expectations. It's much more interesting to me to watch, as a woman, to watch another woman in her own time acting, being interesting and complex within the context of her own time. So I don't know if I really answered your question. As a fellow writer, we sometimes get off topic. But definitely when the pandemic hit, I was like, whoa, I guess this is happening again.
Yeah, kind of, that makes sense to me. It's sort of, looking back, there is context, but but it's not necessarily, when you're actually in the story, you're not thinking of like what you might be predicting.
Well, when I kind of went back to read the stories, I was putting the manuscript of the book together. I was like I was not happy to see some of the behaviors of the characters in the book playing themselves out in real life, of course. And I certainly, as a citizen, as a journalist whose whole job is dedicated to the pursuit of truth over misinformation, rumors, hearsay, baseless ideas, conspiracies even. To see things sort of acting out in a way that seemed to me like that. Yeah, that reminds me of some of the characters in this book. As a writer, to whatever satisfaction it could have, I did have a feeling of like, well, I feel like I've at least told a story that's true.
Yeah.
It has the ring of truth, even though it's a totally hypothetical work of fiction. At least I felt like, I did all the work that I had to do. It wasn't enough to just be inspired. It has to do work. And I thought, well, I guess the story is doing its work. Thank you. So, I'm gonna next read, if you guys are all set, from my poetry book that I have here in the store. I've already signed one copy tonight. I'm like, it's always so great when like fellow writers, come out and to support other writers, but I always try to do. So I mentioned that I'm first generation Irish American, and this poetry book, Pretty Green Thorns, is very much about that experience, which I think, like most people's experience of the heritage that they grow up with, is pretty complicated and messy at times, and certainly tragic at times, but always, leaves its imprint. So I wanted to try to capture some of those things, some of those experiences in poetry. And Halloween, being an Irish person, Halloween to me is one of those things that really makes you proud as an Irish person, because it's one of the influences of people who left their own country under great hardship, mass starvation, actually, to start their life someplace else, that they kind of brought these traditions with them. A lot of the things that we do from Halloween are actually Irish in origin, jack-o'-lantern being one of them. And so Samhain, which is the ancient Celtic observance of first of all, the passing of the old year, the welcoming of the new, and it's a so-called lifting of the veil, when it's thought that spirits from the other side can make their way very readily, and there's a great deal of exchange, and that's not something that translates easily into Western culture. It can be exciting, it can be fearful, it can be hopeful. It's because it's a time not only of saying goodbye to loved ones, but trying to forecast the future a little bit. So, and this book is dedicated to my Irish ancestors who've gone on that other side of the veil. And I think of them at Samhain and always. So, and Irish people like to talk, it's probably clear. So I went to Dublin 3 years ago, in September, and I just took myself on a little self-guided tour around. Most of my family was actually from the southern part of the country, around County Cork. So I just went for 3 days, and just me and my phone, basically. I just used my phone to navigate, and there were places I knew that I wanted to see. One of them is a church called St. Michan's, which, for anyone who's interested in things like catacombs, and evidently this is a kind of a tourism thing now, there are naturally preserved mummies in the basement of this church. And the mummies themselves are fascinating because I looked at them, I said, well, these are people who live lives. There was a crusader, there was a nun, there was a rebel, who went up against the British Empire. And, but one thing I noticed that they also had was roses in the garden. So this poem is really kind of drawing from these people who've gone on, but it's also drawing from the memory of my Uncle Russell, who actually went on to become a celebrated horticulturalist and grew beautiful roses. So a rose is St. Michan's. So St. Michan's Church in Dublin, September 2018. I kept histories in blooms, stem, leaves, thorn, the moon's opening of colors. I called it so when I passed the gate. These petals guard the way to the sleep of the night, the nun, the rebel, the unknown of eyes, teeth, thigh bone. This is some place of growing, some place of secret flowering. One of the dearest people in my mother's immediate family to me was my Aunt Betty and her Uncle John, and her husband, Uncle John Brewster. Betty was very glamorous. She immigrated to London, which is where she met her husband. My Uncle John was British, and she became very much a Londoner. And I felt like when we went to London, and when I do have the chance to go to London, it's often with a feeling of like that they're still with me. And when I went to Ireland in October 2014, and this was shortly after my husband died, they had recently passed away, and I was given her white rosary beads. So, and when I post messages on social media about Samhain and what it really means, because Samhain is one of these Celtic observances that is somewhat taken out of context in our culture. I feel that I like to kind of bring the meaning home. with things such as this white rosary. So this poem is about that, the white rosary. Wear your halo and blue eye shadow, and Mary Quant boots, and a daffodil-covered hat. And wear yours in tweed, in pipe smoke, and a bright song. To both every mystery, joyful, sorrowful, glorious, found to one another, strand to strand. Now, thank you. To me, Irish spirituality is this great interlacing, interplay, and ever vibrant and ever persistent blending of what is sometimes called the pre-Christian time in Ireland, but essentially refers to the indigenous practices, which obviously an observance like Samhain or Beltane would be rooted in. And for an Irish person, there's not as much the divergence that I think is sometimes assumed. The Irish historically being a Catholic majority country, although like much of Europe is coming more secular. But when you grow up in those traditions, quite honestly, you don't actually see, I think, the divergence that is sometimes assumed. The presence of the old spirituality is old, but it's not extinct. It exists in everything and everybody, and is acknowledged as such. So this poem is sort of an homage to that. Also, since we are a seafaring people and we're surrounded by ocean and sea, it's called the Seafoam Witch. What we have raised from the cast of driftwood spark to spark in the crush of the wave is what we have prayed, script in the sand. Our fingers will cross, and the gray-green froth will yet speak to what we've become. And I'd like to read just one more poem from this book. This is also about a figure from Irish mythology, or what's sometimes referred to as pagan Ireland. The Morrigan is a name, and I freely admit this, as first generation of Irish, seeing the Morrigan in role-playing, in different elements of popular culture, taken very, very much out of its original context. I guess I'm not shy, being from that culture, of saying, you need to research this. You need to understand that it comes from a place and a time, and it is sacred to the people from whom it comes. And one does not become the Morrigan simply by saying, I am the Morrigan. There is only one Morrigan. Tradition holds that the Morrigan, which is is really a being of three entities that is highly ambivalent in Irish folklore. The Morrigan are mysterious even to the Irish, but the Morrigan is associated with fate, especially in battle. It's a female symbol. It is associated with the crow. In fact, in my garden, I have a garden flag with a crow on it that stays up all year to give props. So this is a poem about speaking to all of that. It's called Mending the Morrigan. I will keep your name like the trees circling a field. Dust devils dance, grass murmurs in October's wind. This is your home, your bed, though strangers divide you again and again. I will keep your name, hold you in all the threads of ferocity. I will raise my arms to your swift-moving clouds and the rush of crows' cries. Thank you so much for listening to my poem from Green Thorns. Thank you so much. And again, if there's any questions or anything I can answer or try to answer.
Yeah. I'm pretty Irish. I'm very European in ancestry, but my family's been in America for enough generations where I don't really have much of a connection. And I always feel a little sad about that because I feel like sometimes it's an interesting place to be in when you're from America and your ancestral ties are American for so long. You don't have that kind of like ancientness to your family or anything like that, I suppose, in a way. But I've been to Ireland. I want to go to London someday, but it's, I guess this is less of a question and more of a compliment, I suppose. I really love listening to people connecting back to those roots, and I'm jealous sometimes of how close you can get, just because I feel like a lot of younger generations of Americans, we're here. We haven't been anywhere else for some time. So.
I totally appreciate what you're saying. And as I always, mentioned to people, like, my Irish family, they're a very modern family, and they live in the modern day nation state of Ireland, and pretty much Ireland, like most modern nation states, sort of grapples with modern problems. Certainly the pandemic, my friends and family over there post about the impact that it's having on them. Taxes, employment, their relationship to the EU, their relationship to the UK, and all those things. And I interact with them as just basically, I'm coming back over from America, and I'm visiting them, and we sort of talk about what's going on in our lives in the here and now. But certainly for me, I'm very much just ever aware of, you can almost just feel like, here we are in our present day place, but we are surrounded by just like it's almost like the ancestors are like the rings of a tree, spreading out.
Not to say that they're running around with swords still.
Well, I always feel like, I often feel like, I try to understand them, as best I can, because they're part of what got me where I am, today, and who I am today, as all our ancestors are, and some of that, sadly, was during the mass starvation in Ireland. There was a whole swath of the population that was needlessly lost to hunger, and with them went many institutional memories. Their language almost went, and a lot of just what sustained people from generation to next, and that really makes an impression on you. That when there are people who come, or their ancestors that have come from something like that, you really understand. It's a feeling of like, well, I'm here, I'm alive, and that's an obligation and a privilege to keep these things going for the people who had it taken from them, and including their very lives. So it's like frayed threads, but you can still, pull the threads.
Yeah.
You can still pull the threads together to keep the story going.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. Thanks for listening to my words, and listening to the words from both of the books that I read from tonight. And it's really great to be supported by a local bookstore. And I always have been going out, including to the Lowell Celebrates Kerouac Festival, which is this past weekend, just spreading the word for books to come here as well.
Thank you.
So, thank you very much. Thank you.